Australia is located in Oceania. It is the only country in the world that occupies an entire continent in a natural geographical sense. Neighbors with New Zealand, Indonesia, East Timor, Singapore, Malaysia, etc. Among them, Indonesia and Australia are each other's largest neighbors. During Indonesia's struggle for independence from 1945 to 1950, the Australian government's support won the goodwill of the Indonesian people. In 1950, Indonesia once again declared independence and successfully joined the United Nations, which was also the year the two countries formally established diplomatic relations, followed by cooperation agreements in trade, economy, culture, education, healthcare, science and technology, as well as comprehensive cooperation in the military and security fields. But Indonesia, with its huge population, made Australia feel a little threatened, and more worried about the penetration of Indonesian power into the South Pacific, and affecting its own interests. Thus, when the Netherlands refused to return West Irian to the Indonesian government, and the two countries were locked in a confrontation, Australia chose to support the Netherlands as a way to suppress Indonesia. It was not until 1963 that the U.S. Kennedy administration stepped in and returned West Irian to Indonesia and had the Netherlands and Australia evacuate West Irian. But relations between Indonesia and Australia have also been severely affected. There is another reason why Australia has chosen to support the Netherlands. Situated between Australia and Southeast Asia, West Irian has a very strategic position, and is rich in mineral resources such as oil and uranium. Australia is known to be rich in mineral resources, oil and gas, and is the world's largest exporter of bituminous coal, bauxite, lead, diamonds, zinc and concentrates. So Indonesia and Australia are not only neighbors, but also competitors. For example, Indonesia has coal reserves of 58 billion tons and natural gas reserves of 123,589 trillion cubic meters. Australia's coal reserves are 147,435 million tons and its natural gas reserves are 1,360 billion cubic meters. The market share is limited, and Australia's economic development is dependent on trade exports, and is not willing to let Indonesia take the export share of resources. Since then, Australia and Indonesia have established diplomatic relations, but at the same time they are competing and hostile to each other, and the Australian government has seized every opportunity to suppress Indonesia to protect its own interests. In the early 1960s, the Federation of Malaya was intended to merge with Singapore, Sarawak, Sabah and Brunei to form the Federation of Malaysia, but Indonesia believes that Sabah and Sarawak belong to Indonesia, while the Philippines believes that Sabah belongs to the Philippines, and both Indonesia and the Philippines have protested against this. Indonesia also launched the Crush Malaysia program, a terrorist attack and military invasion of Malaysia. The Australian government seized this opportunity to suppress Indonesia again, with Australia sending direct military support to confront the Indonesian army, on the grounds that Malaysia was a member of the Commonwealth. On December 7, 1975, Indonesia sent troops to East Timor, and imposed an occupation on the grounds that the East Timorese leaders had asked for their help. It lasted until after the 1999 referendum on East Timor's independence. UN Security Council approves establishment of a multinational force with a unified command structure led by Australia. Eventually Indonesia withdraws its troops. November 2013, the Australian Broadcasting Corporation in the British newspaper, The Guardian reported on documents provided by Snowden, the man who exposed the US PRISM intelligence program. The Australian Signal Council has tapped the cell phone communications of Indonesian President Susilo, his wife and various government officials. Another document shows that the Signals Council has tried to tap Indonesian President Susilo's cell phone conversations at least once. And in August 2009 the Australian Signal Council tracked Susilo's cell phone status for 15 consecutive days and recorded the phone numbers he spoke with and the length of the calls. The Indonesian side was very shocked and decided to recall its ambassador to Australia. In a media interview the following day, Australian Prime Minister Tony Abbott declined to answer whether he would call Susilo to explain or apologize. Relations between the two countries are strained. Subsequently, Trajali Nusantara Indonesia, an Indonesian state-owned company, announced the suspension of dialogue with Australian ranchers, saying there were trust issues between the two sides. In addition to Indonesia, New Zealand has a very close relationship with Australia. The Australia-New Zealand relationship is also known as the Trans-Tasman relationship. Both countries were colonized by the British, and they share the same head of state. New Zealand soldiers fought alongside Australian soldiers in the Boer War and in both world wars, but they also compete in sports as well as in commercial trade. For example, Australia had long banned the import of New Zealand apples. In 1919, Australia discovered fire blight in apples imported from New Zealand, and the following year declared a ban on the import of New Zealand apples. It was not until 2007 that the ban on the import of New Zealand apples was finally lifted in Australia after the efforts of New Zealand. The 90-year-long trade war finally took a turn for the worse, but a series of additional import quarantine requirements were stringent, including the complete elimination of various fruit-prone diseases such as European ulcer and apple leaf roller. New Zealand argued that Australia was erecting trade barriers, and took it to the WTO Arbitration Tribunal. The Australian Minister of Agriculture at the time said he supported the Australian side to start importing New Zealand apples because it had to implement the WTO ruling, and because he feared that New Zealand would take retaliatory trade measures, such as imposing high tariffs on some goods imported from Australia, including sugar, Australia's largest export to New Zealand, beef, which ranks second, and some other citrus fruits. In recent years, Australia's frequent provocations against China have led to a steady deterioration in trade relations with China, with restrictions on Australia's exports to China of fresh grapes as well as wine, cotton, timber, lobster and beef. Instead, New Zealand took the opportunity to sign the FTA upgrade agreement with China. China has further opened up to New Zealand on the basis of the agreement in areas such as aviation, education and finance, in addition to gaining zero tariff access for 99% of New Zealand's exports of timber and paper products to China. By 2024, all New Zealand dairy products exported to China will also have zero tariff access. This has a positive effect on the economic development of New Zealand. It seems that although Australia maintains diplomatic ties with these neighboring countries and allies, they do not hesitate to take each other's market share when it comes to their own interests.